First of all, how significant do you think these protests around the world could turn out to be?
Well, my hope is that they are very significant, or turn out to be very significant, in moving many conversations, many uncomfortable conversations that people on both sides of that ethnic divide have been dreading. But we now see and recognize the need to have them. What then happens, well, what will make it significant is how everybody else responds. What do our boardrooms look like? What do our political representation look like going forward? That's the most important aspect to this. Now that they recognize the value in understanding and eradicating what essentially is a human rights abuse.
Yeah, I mean, we've seen it before, haven't we, with other black men killed by police officers, Trayvon Martin, Eric Garner, Michael Brown, and nothing much changed. There were protests, but nothing much changed. Why would this be different, do you think?
This just feels different on the ground, for starters, Mark. And I think there's a number of reasons for that. For instance, over the last 3 or 4 weeks, you've had Ahmaud Arbery murdered while out for a jog at the hands of vigilantes. That murder was swept under the carpet at the highest levels of city government until it was exposed. So you understand the cover-up that also goes in and the protectionism around law enforcement in many places here in the U.S. Following on that, you had Breonna Taylor shot to death in her own bed by police officers out of uniform, executing a warrant. You've had Christian Cooper, who had the police call on him after he rightly asked a white lady to leash a dog, as the law suggested. And then finally, you had George Floyd murdered at the hands of police while the police officer had his own hands in his pockets and staring down a camera, knowing full well that he was being recorded. Also, as I often say, Mark, these things don't happen in a vacuum. A few weeks prior to that, white people took assault weapons, took over government buildings to demand haircuts, if their signs are to believe. It's a huge disparity in what's been demanding and the justice that they've been afforded, and you're seeing that in the turnout in the streets.
So when you saw what happened to George Floyd on the streets of the country that you're now living in, what were your emotions?
I was heartbroken. As a father, I had to have these discussions with my son about not just about how you stay out of trouble, but the underpinning to that is how, as a black man in the US, you stay alive. And how you aren't afforded the same luxuries, the same rights. And it's terrible that we have to talk about rights as a luxury for black people here in the US. And to be careful. So just as a parent, I have to speak to my kids about what they can and cannot do in an effort simply to stay alive. And that's a tough conversation for any parent to have, regardless of what the issue is.
And, I mean, you've got a 12-year-old son, I think I'm right in saying. So you've been talking to him about the images that he's no doubt been seeing on television.
Yes, well, I've been speaking to my son. My wife and I have 5 kids, 4 girls and a boy. Our boy is the youngest at 12. Our eldest girl is 23 now, and we've got quite a few in between. So we've been having to have these conversations on a number of different levels. As I mentioned, from a 12-year-old all the way up to a 23-year-old, and what programs and how they can all effect change, firstly, with their own communities, with their own friends, how they can have those conversations and move those discussions forward in better affecting and mobilizing our own local communities, who I freely hold my hands up and admit are majority Caucasian. But we have to have these conversations. We have to have these efforts in moving them forward. So it's been a tough and testing time. Yeah. My wife and I also went into Boston to join in one of the marches, and to see the diversity and the youth amongst us, it lifted that burden off of my shoulder, and you realize that it's in very good hands. The young people of today will change this world.
Yeah, Shaka, we're just going to show you some pictures while I talk to you, and these are live pictures, I think, of a memorial service taking place in Houston, in Texas, right now. That's where George Floyd grew up and lived before he moved to Minneapolis, and people filing past his coffin. But the protests here, Shaka, have become more than about George Floyd, about racism more broadly in Britain. You've lived in both countries. Is there a different experience to racism in these countries?
Of course, there are some differences, but then there are far too many similarities, and I think that's the unifying force here. Also, and not just in the US or in Britain, you've seen this protest pretty much the world over, and I think what that speaks to, Mark, is that as much as the death of George Floyd has been a spark, and as much as we may be carrying signs about Black Lives Matter, this ultimately is a human rights issue. And when the human rights of Black people are affected, the human rights of the LGBTQ community are affected. The human rights of women, of asylum seekers, of immigrants are similarly affected. And so there's been a unity in that voice and in the groundswell. And we also have to recognize our own responsibilities. I was having a discussion with my wife last night about our responsibilities as Black people to go out and support the Latino community, to go out and support the LGBTQ community. We are, albeit it's easy to forget, in the middle of Pride Month here in the US. We have to go out and support more of these marginalized communities, because ultimately the underpinning of all of this is human rights. And when we all uplift each other's human rights, we all benefit.
OK, and just finally, what about football? What responsibility, and I'm thinking here in the UK, what responsibility do the authorities have to be part of the answer to this? What should they be doing about racism in football?
Well, continue to support the players who are speaking up as we see, but you can go further in terms of proper implementation of the Rooney Rule. Also, what does the diversity of boardrooms of football clubs look like? What does the diversity of the within the offices of the Premier League or the FA? Those are things that they can lead from in the front and lead by example.
OK, and just in 20 seconds, would you like to see Premier League players take the knee in the first Premier League games that are about to start in 10 days' time behind closed doors?
I certainly would. I think the symbolizing will be huge and impactful. I also would like to see football clubs and Premier League footballers continue long after you've gotten off your knee.
All right, it's good to talk to you, Shaka Hislop. Thank you very much indeed.